John Oliver's latest video on Israel is appalling. In it, like a true European supremacist, he lectures Middle Eastern people about the Middle East, while being utterly clueless on the subject. Stick around as I correct his false narrative and wipe that smug grin from his face with some real history.
Israel was founded in 1948, fulfilling the long-held hopes of the Zionist movement at a time when Jews were reeling from the collective traumas of persecution and genocide in the Holocaust.
His simplistic summary misses a crucial point. Jews weren't just persecuted in Europe. They faced centuries of massacres and oppression in the Arab world. The re-establishment of Israel was not just a legitimate act of self-determination, but the creation of a sanctuary for Jews fleeing this persecution. Remember, Israel declared independence just 3 years after the Holocaust, of which the Jews were a victim. He then goes on to invert history by painting aggressors as victims.
Through what Israel calls the War of Independence and what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, or catastrophe. 700,000 Palestinians suffered their own collective trauma when they fled or were driven out of their homes amid violence and, in some cases, massacres of entire villages.
John conveniently omits a key fact. The war began when 5 Arab armies invaded Israel with genocidal intent. The infamous Azam Pasha declared, "This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre." But their genocide failed. So John and those like him attempt to invert history and paint the Jews as the aggressors. But they weren't. 850,000 Jews were forced out of the Arab world, including the West Bank and Jerusalem. And despite his accusation, there were no massacres of entire villages. Exaggerated claims like Deir Yassin are easily refuted. But as always, this is a projection. It was Jewish villages like Kfar Tzion that suffered brutal massacres. Details Mr. Oliver conveniently leaves out. But it gets worse, as next he seems to tacitly endorse the ethnic cleansing of Jews.
Israel fought and defeated Egypt, Syria and Jordan, and in doing so captured vastly more territory, including the West Bank. Almost immediately, it started building settlements there, while also annexing East Jerusalem.
What he calls settlements is simply Jews returning to the homes they were ethnically cleansed from in 1948. To that point, I wonder if he's ever asked the question, why are there 2 million Arab citizens of Israel, but not one Jewish Palestinian? If he did, he'd realise it was the Jews who were ethnically cleansed and not the Arabs. His opposition to Jews in Judea is a tacit endorsement of their original cleansing. As for Jerusalem, there is no such thing as East Jerusalem. It never existed until Jordan conquered the old city and expelled its Jewish population, who, by the way, had been the city's largest population since at least 1844. Okay, and now for the awkward plug. I hate to do this, but if you want to help us make more videos like this, then please support us on Patreon. Every video is funded from there.
Both those actions constitute violations of international law. When you occupy territory as an outcome of war, you are not allowed to expel people or move your own citizens in, and Israel knew this at the time.
This legal argument is so common, yet so deeply flawed. The League of Nations mandate for Palestine explicitly encouraged close settlement by Jews on the land, including state lands and wastelands not required for public purposes. This right was preserved by Article 80 of the United Nations Charter. In simple terms, this meant that international law explicitly called out the right of Jews to settle in all of the land, including the West Bank, provided that the rights and position of other sections of the population were not prejudiced. Which is what happened until 1948, when Jordan annexed the West Bank, temporarily preventing Jewish settlement. As a side note, it was at this point that Jordan renamed Judea and Samaria the West Bank. Before that, it was Judea and Samaria, the Jewish names. Jordan being on the East Bank and Judea and Samaria being the West Bank of the Jordan River. Anyway, once Israel drove the Jordanians out in the '67 war, the land had no recognised sovereign. So the returning Jews were not occupying someone else's property, as John alleges. Also, Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which he references without naming, was intended to prevent atrocities like those committed by the Germans in World War II, not the voluntary return of civilians to their ancestral land. Obviously, John is clueless to all of this, but he hopes that by speaking in a smug and condescending tone that he can convince you that he knows what he's talking about. But what he says next is evident that he really doesn't.
After Oslo fell apart for reasons including, but not limited to, continued settlement expansion, terror attacks by Palestinian militants and Israeli hardliners assassinating the Prime Minister who'd brokered the deal, Yitzhak Rabin.
Oslo didn't fall apart due to settlement expansion. What is he talking about? It collapsed because Arafat responded to Oslo by launching the Second Intifada, a wave of Palestinian terrorism. Despite this, Israel continued to make significant concessions, which even saw them disengage from Gaza in 2005. But instead of peace, this led to Hamas using Gaza to launch attacks on Israel, culminating in the horrific events of October the 7th. Let's continue watching.
Quality of life settlers. And I will say, the way they describe their communities does make them seem very attractive.
The quality of life is so much better. It has nothing to do with politics.
Well, hold on. It has nothing to do with politics? I'm sorry, but it very much does. Just because it's a nice place to live doesn't make it any less illegal under international law.
What a condescending pillock. The Dunning-Kruger effect is in full swing with John. What he doesn't realise is that much of this land was Ottoman state land, which then became British mandatory state land, which, according to the mandate, Jews were legally entitled to settle. Those settlements that weren't built on state land were legally purchased by Jews at exorbitant rates. But this doesn't matter to John because in his worldview, only Arabs have a right to live there, even if they never owned the land and only recently arrived. So it's getting quite legal. I should probably explain how the West Bank is legally structured. But first, let's hear John's enlightened take.
The legal rights of Palestinians in the West Bank are tenuous at best. There are actually two sets of laws there. Jewish settlers enjoy access to civilian law, due process and the full protection of civil rights, but Palestinians live under Israeli military law. So if they're accused of a crime, they're tried in military courts.
His depiction of the legal situation in the West Bank is grossly misleading. Palestinians in areas A and B live under the Palestinian Authority, not Israeli law. The Palestinian Authority has its own police force, judicial system and civil administration. 94% of the West Bank's Palestinians live here. 6% of the Arabs in the West Bank live in Area C. There are around 200,000 of them. In contrast, there's 500,000 Jews here. Applying Israeli law to Palestinians in Area C would effectively annex the territory, ending the possibility of John's beloved two-state solution. This is why Palestinians in Area C live under Israeli military law, which is a necessary security measure and not a form of discrimination. Military law is applied to manage security concerns and maintain order, especially given the ongoing conflict and threats of terrorism, which John acknowledges before trying to obfuscate with misleading statistics.
Settlers will argue that they live in constant fear of violence, and it is true that over the last 16 years, 150 Israelis have been killed by Palestinians in the West Bank. Though it is worth noting that in that same period, more than 10 times that many Palestinians were killed by Israelis, the vast majority directly by Israeli security forces.
This is so disingenuous. Here are some of the Palestinians John is mourning. You see, most Palestinians killed in the West Bank were engaged in violent acts or linked to extremist groups. A subtle detail he fails to mention, a courtesy he doesn't extend to the Israelis.
In 2022, Benjamin Netanyahu, in order to hold on to power, formed a governing coalition by allying with leaders of far-right parties, creating the most right-wing government in Israel's history.
While Israel's current government may be the most right-wing to date, they seem like angels compared to the Palestinian Authority. Take Mahmoud Abbas, the PA's moderate leader. He did his PhD in Holocaust denial and is on record saying, "We welcome every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem." He continued, "With the help of Allah, every martyr, and by that he means terrorist, will be in heaven, and every wounded person will get his reward." Oh, and boy do they reward them. If a Palestinian murders a Jew, he receives a pension for life. The more Jews he murders, the larger his pension. But John Oliver wants you to think it's the Israelis who are right-wing. Anyway, let's get back to watching him embarrass himself.
Then the appalling attacks of October 7th happened, and since then, things have gotten considerably worse. Israel imposed even tighter restrictions on Palestinian movement in the West Bank, with checkpoints increasingly closed and many work permits cancelled, making it impossible for many Palestinians there to make a living.
The permits he's talking about are for Palestinians to work in Israel. Israel isn't under any moral or legal obligation to employ a hostile neighbour's citizens. It's insane. I should also point out that 82% of the Palestinians in the West Bank supported Hamas in the October 7th massacre. Why on earth would Israel allow these people into its territory? That would be an insane security risk. But back to John.
And when you take all of this together, you do begin to understand why so many Israelis and Palestinians have despaired of ever achieving a two-state solution.
Arab leaders have repeatedly rejected two-state solutions, starting with the 1937 Peel Commission, which offered the Jews just 3.5% of British Mandatory Palestine. Since then, the Arabs have rejected at least 5 distinct two-state solutions. The one proposed by Olmert offered them basically all of the West Bank and Gaza, with a capital in East Jerusalem. Unsurprisingly, Abbas said no. While Israel is willing to share the land, tragically, the Arab leadership is not. But what John ends with is by far the most offensive thing he's said in his 20-minute diatribe.
Look, a phrase that gets brought up a lot with regard to Israel is never again, an anti-genocide slogan often invoked in memory of the Holocaust, and it's always been open to 2 interpretations. There's the one that means this must never again happen to the Jewish people, and the one that means this must never again happen to any people anywhere. And in the West Bank, as in Gaza right now, it's pretty clear which one the Israeli government has favoured.
This is the most appalling statement in this video. Comparing the slaughter of 6 million Jews to the conditions in the West Bank is outrageous and offensive. Palestinians in the West Bank live with relatively high standards, and their population has increased by 400% since Israel's so-called occupation. Equating this to the genocide of Europe's Jews is not only false, but brazen anti-Semitism. My family was slaughtered, beaten, starved, shot and gassed by the Nazis. To infer that Israeli Jews are Nazis is grotesque. John Oliver's distorted narrative serves only to misinform and inflame. Maybe next time, John, try reading a book on the subject before lecturing the world with your supremacist attitude. Your ancestors literally burnt mine alive, and you want to tell me where I can and can't live? On your bike. For thousands of years, we lived with your boot on our throat. Never again. Today, we live as free men in our ancestral homeland. Cope harder.